The night along the southern African coast was eerily quiet, as if the very wind had held its breath in anticipation. The air carried the scent of salt, mixed with the faint promise of a coming storm. President Ibrahim Traoré sat in his modest office at the presidential palace, surrounded by routine files and administrative paperwork. The yellow glow of the desk lamp cast long shadows across the walls, and the only sound was the gentle rustle of papers as he worked through yet another evening of governance. A sudden commotion broke the silence. A young military officer burst through the door, his boots echoing against the marble floor. In his trembling hands, he held an old mobile phone with a shattered screen, its surface spider-webbed with cracks that spoke of hard use and harder times. "Sir," the officer said breathlessly, his voice tight with urgency. This video was sent anonymously. The sender is a woman. Her name is Isama Kante. Traoré's hands froze mid-motion over the documents. Isama, he whispered, the name stirring memories long buried beneath the weight of presidential duties. She was his mother's distant niece, a woman who had dedicated her life to community work in a small coastal village in southern Burkina Faso. They had lost touch over the years, separated by the demands of his military career and eventual rise to leadership. With careful deliberation, Traoré took the phone and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, revealing a scene of devastation that made his jaw tighten. Smoke billowed across the frame, thick and acrid. The sounds of women crying pierced through the chaos, their wails mixing with the crash of breaking glass. Shattered bottles of herbal drinks lay scattered across the sand like broken promises. One woman sat amid the wreckage, her weathered hands clutching the remnants of her livelihood, tears streaming down her face as she rocked back and forth in grief. Behind the camera, Isama's voice trembled with barely contained emotion as she narrated the horror. "This is our chief, Umoja Chakate. He comes every single day. He takes money from the women, beats the children, and destroys the belongings of anyone who dares refuse him. Yesterday he set fire to my stall. Please, for the love of God, help us. We are drowning in fear, and there is no one to pull us out." The video ended abruptly, leaving the room in crushing silence. Traoré felt his fists clench involuntarily, his knuckles turning white with the force of his grip. This wasn't simple extortion or petty theft. This was systematic terror, the kind that breaks communities and destroys the human spirit. Before him on the desk lay a large map of the country, its surface marked with pins and notes indicating various regional concerns. He traced his finger along the southern coastline until it rested on a tiny dot representing the village where Isama lived. It seemed impossibly small on the map, just another forgotten corner of the nation. But Traoré knew that justice wasn't measured by the size of a place on a map, but by the dignity of the people who called it home. "I will go myself," he announced, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The young officer's eyes widened. "But sir, protocol requires—" "I'm not asking for permission or following protocol," Traoré interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "I'm informing you of my decision. When the law cannot reach the oppressed, leadership must walk to them on its own feet." As darkness deepened outside, a single jeep emerged from the rear entrance of the presidential compound. There was no motorcade, no security detail of dozens of vehicles, no fanfare or official announcement. Just Ibrahim Traoré, two trusted officers who had served with him since his military days, and a broken road that led toward the sea. The jeep's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the sandy path ahead. As they drove, Traoré spoke quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for his companions to hear. "If the screams of these women can reach me in the capital, then the power of their oppressor will also reach me. And this time my response will not be silence." In the distance, lightning flashed over the ocean, illuminating the churning waves for a brief moment. The jeep kicked up plumes of sand as it accelerated toward the village, carrying with it the promise of justice long delayed. As dawn approached, the jeep arrived at the village entrance. A weathered wooden sign hung askew on a makeshift post, its paint faded but still legible. "Welcome to Umoja Chakate's territory." The words weren't just a greeting. They were a declaration of ownership, a warning to all who entered that they were stepping into someone else's domain. Traoré reached out and touched the sign. His fingers coming away covered in a layer of grime accumulated over months or perhaps years of unchallenged authority. He wiped his hand on his pants and muttered, "Tyranny always writes its own name so that history knows exactly what to erase." At that moment, his phone buzzed with another message. The text was from Isama, sent just minutes earlier. "He's coming again tomorrow. If we survive, you might not receive another message from us. This may be our last chance." Traoré looked up at the sky, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to paint the horizon. "Tomorrow the sun will rise over your village not just with light, but with the first rays of justice." The sun rose slowly over the southern coast of Africa, its golden light spilling across the sand and casting long shadows from the palm trees that dotted the shoreline. The air was thick with the smell of salt water mixed with the lingering scent of ash, remnants of Isama's herbal stall that had burned the night before. Isama herself sat beneath a coconut palm, a woman of 30 years whose face bore the marks of both strength and exhaustion. She was methodically collecting bottle caps from the sand, salvaging what little she could from yesterday's destruction. Her hands were covered in small cuts and burns, but her eyes held no fear. Instead, they burned with a quiet, simmering anger that had been building for years. She had become a symbol of hope for the other women in the village, teaching them that even a small amount of courage could change a life. On the other side of the beach, the sound of engines shattered the morning peace. Umoja Chakati's convoy appeared on the horizon like a dark omen. The lead vehicle was a black SUV with tinted windows, its engine roaring as it tore across the sand. Behind it followed a pickup truck carrying 4 armed thugs, their faces twisted with arrogance and cruelty. Umoja Chakate was known throughout the region as the Devil of the Sand. His philosophy was brutally simple: everything that earns belongs to me. He had established himself as the unofficial chief of the coastal villages through a combination of violence, intimidation, and strategic alliances with corrupt local officials who looked the other way in exchange for a cut of his illegal profits. The SUV skidded to a halt in front of Aisama's makeshift stall, kicking up a cloud of sand that settled slowly in the humid air. Umoja stepped out, his appearance carefully crafted to intimidate. He wore designer sunglasses, multiple gold rings on each finger, and a leather jacket despite the heat. His boots were imported, his watch expensive. Everything about him screamed wealth extracted from poverty. "Woman," he bellowed, his voice carrying across the beach, "I see you're setting up bottles again. What did I tell you yesterday?" Isama kept her head bowed, her voice deliberately humble. "I am poor, Chief. I'm only trying to earn enough to feed my family." Umoja laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Earn? On my beach? You need my permission to breathe this air. I registered this beach at the district office. Without my permission, all your papers are just ash waiting to burn." He gestured to his men, who moved forward with practiced efficiency. One kicked over the small refrigerator Isama had painstakingly repaired after the previous day's attack. Bottles scattered across the sand, their contents spilling out and soaking into the ground like blood. Another thug laughed as he deliberately stepped on several bottles, grinding them into the sand with his heel. "Where's the money I asked for yesterday?" Umoja demanded, looming over Isama. With shaking hands, she pulled out a small cloth bag and emptied it into her palm. A handful of coins glinted in the sunlight. "I only have 50 francs. I'll bring the rest tomorrow, I promise." Umoja snatched the coins and threw them into the sand with contempt. "Promises don't pay taxes. Mercy isn't for sale on my beach. Bring the full amount by tomorrow, or next time, it won't be your stall that burns. It will be your house." His words hung in the air like gunpowder waiting for a spark. The women of the village hugged their children close, and even the men remained silent, knowing that speaking up meant inviting similar or worse treatment onto their own families. Umoja lit a cigarette and took a long drag, savoring the moment of absolute power. As he walked back to his vehicle, he called over his shoulder, "Anyone who helps this woman will meet the same fate. Remember that." The convoy drove away, leaving behind only dust and despair. As the sound of the engines faded, Isama finally allowed herself to cry, but her tears were brief. With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone and took photographs. The broken bottles, the scattered coins in the sand, the char marks on the ground from yesterday's fire. She uploaded the images to an encrypted link and typed a 2-word message. He came again. By evening, a heavy silence had settled over the village. Everyone knew something had to change, but no one believed change was possible. They didn't know that justice was already on its way, traveling down that broken coastal road in an old military jeep. When the second morning came and fog rolled in from the ocean, obscuring the horizon, an olive-green military jeep made its way slowly across the sand. At the wheel sat Ibrahim Traoré himself, though no one in the village would have recognized him in his current appearance. Gone were the formal suits and military insignia. Instead, he wore simple civilian clothes, a plain shirt, worn pants, and old boots caked with dust from the journey. A weathered canvas bag hung from his shoulder. His face bore the same determined expression that had served him well on battlefields and in political negotiations. But now it was softened by the guise of an ordinary traveler. His 2 companions had been instructed to address him only as Captain, a common enough title that wouldn't draw suspicion. This anonymity was crucial. Traoré wanted to see the situation with his own eyes, to understand the depth of the problem before revealing his identity and wielding the full weight of presidential authority. The road to the village was long and desolate. They passed mud-brick houses where children played barefoot in the dirt, their laughter a bright contrast to the worry visible in their mothers' eyes. Women sat outside their homes, cooking fish over open fires, but there was a tension in their movements, a constant vigilance as if expecting danger at any moment. At a curve in the road, a hand-painted sign caught Traoré's attention. Coastal Beach, pay Umoja's tax for safe passage. He ordered the driver to stop and stepped out to examine the sign more closely. The wood was weathered, but the message had been repainted recently, ensuring its threat remained visible. When the law allows tyrants to collect taxes in its name, revolution is inevitable, Traoré murmured, running his fingers over the rough lettering. They continued into the village center, where curious eyes followed their vehicle. An elderly fisherman with a bent back approached slowly, leaning heavily on a walking stick carved from driftwood. "You've come for tourism?" the old man asked, his voice raspy with age. "Don't stay long, friend. This beach belongs to Umoja." Traoré affected a casual tone. "Is he really as dangerous as people say?" The fisherman's laugh was bitter. "Dangerous? No, he's worse than dangerous. He's hungry for money, for power, for control. He swallows dignity and hope like they're nothing. Those who speak against him disappear by the next morning." Traoré sat down on a weathered bench made from an old boat hull and observed his surroundings with practiced eyes. He saw the broken stalls where women tried to sell their goods, the empty bowls where children should have been eating, and in the distance, the rhythmic crash of ocean waves that seemed to drown out all cries for help. That's when Isama appeared, a scarf covering her head, her face marked by exhaustion that went deeper than physical weariness. She approached cautiously, studying this stranger who didn't quite fit the typical pattern of village visitors. "Captain," she said quietly, using the title his companions had employed. "You're the one I sent the message to, aren't you?" Traoré met her eyes and nodded. "I came to hear your voice in person, and to see why your tears have been forced into silence for so long." Isama led him to the corner of the beach where her stall had stood. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, mixing with the salt breeze. Charred wood and melted plastic marked the spot where she had tried to build a livelihood. "This is where I sold herbal drinks," she explained, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Umoja's men come every day to collect their tax. When I refused to pay yesterday, I simply didn't have the money. They burned everything. My drinks, my equipment, even the little table I inherited from my grandmother." Traoré crouched down and ran his hand through the sand, feeling the residual heat from yesterday's fire. "Sand always cools after burning," he said thoughtfully. "But when people remain silent out of fear, their ashes never cool. The heat of injustice keeps burning inside them." Isama's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's coming again this afternoon. He always comes at the same time, like his cruelty rises with the sun." Traoré stood and looked at the horizon where the sun was climbing higher. "Tomorrow the sun won't just bring heat. It will bring fire. the kind that purifies rather than destroys. By noon, an unnatural silence had fallen over the beach. Even the ocean seemed to hold its breath as if nature itself was waiting to witness what would unfold. Isama gestured for Traoré to conceal himself behind a cluster of old coconut palms, their trunks scarred by years of weather and neglect. "He'll be here any moment," she whispered. "He's always punctual in his tyranny." Traoré watched as the women of the village hurried to hide their goods and pull their children inside. The fear was palpable, a living thing that infected everyone it touched. In the distance, the familiar sound of engines announced Umoja's arrival, the roar of the SUV, the aggressive beat of music blaring from speakers, the cruel laughter of men who had never faced consequences for their actions. The black vehicle skidded to a stop, and Umoja emerged like a predator surveying his territory. Today he wore gold-rimmed sunglasses and had added several more rings to his already bejeweled fingers. His leather jacket gleamed despite the heat, and his boots left deep impressions in the sand, marks of dominance he enjoyed leaving behind. "Look at my brave subjects," he shouted mockingly to his 4 accompanying thugs, each carrying clubs and chains. "These women still haven't learned that this land isn't theirs, it's mine." One of the thugs laughed. "Should we cool down their hot heads today, boss?" A young man, no more than 17, stepped forward from the crowd. He sold coconut water with his mother and had watched his family's income steadily decrease as Umoja's demands grew larger. "Chief, please," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Give us one more day. We'll have the money tomorrow." Umoja's response was immediate and brutal. His hand lashed out in a vicious slap that sent the young man sprawling onto the sand. "I am the law here," Umoja roared. "My beach, my rules." Behind the palms, Traoré's fists clenched so tightly his knuckles cracked. His breathing grew heavy, but he forced himself to remain hidden. He needed to witness the full extent of the crime to ensure there would be undeniable evidence when justice finally came. Umoja now approached Isama's stall, where she had carefully arranged her bottles in neat rows, determined to keep working despite yesterday's destruction. "Woman," he bellowed, "I burned your stall yesterday. Today I'll burn your courage." He kicked the small table, sending bottles flying. They shattered against rocks and sand, their contents spreading like golden blood across the beach. Another thug joined in, deliberately stomping on bottles that had survived the initial assault, grinding glass into the sand with sadistic pleasure. Isama's voice trembled but remained defiant. "Umoja, one day this same land will swallow you whole." Umoja's laughter was cruel. "The land will swallow me? I am the land." From behind the palms, Traoré emerged, his movements calm and deliberate. His voice when he spoke was quiet, but carried across the beach with unmistakable authority. "Then let's see whose land this really is." The wind seemed to stop entirely. The sun blazed overhead, but in that moment it felt as if darkness was descending. Everyone on the beach, villagers, thugs, even Umoja himself, froze. They all sensed that something fundamental had just shifted, though they didn't yet understand what. Umoja turned to face this stranger who dared to challenge him. To his eyes, Traoré was just another traveler, perhaps a merchant or tourist foolish enough to interfere in local matters. "So, another newcomer wants to learn a lesson?" Umoja sneered. "This is my beach. People don't even breathe here without paying my tax, let alone cast a shadow on my sand." Traoré took a step forward, his eyes locked on Umoja's. "This beach was created by God, not inherited by tyrants. It belongs to the people who work it, not the parasites who bleed it dry." Umoja's face flushed with anger. "You like to talk, don't you? I teach everyone the price of running their mouth." He gestured to his men, and 2 stepped forward. One carried an iron rod, the other a thick rope. "Tie up this stranger," Umoja commanded. "Let everyone see what happens when you challenge Umoja on his own beach." Traoré didn't move, his stance relaxed but ready. "I don't fight people," he said calmly, "until I'm certain they've abandoned their humanity. And you, Umoja, abandoned yours long ago." "What did you say?" Umoja's voice rose to a shout. "Humanity is measured not by power but by justice," Traoré replied, his voice steady as stone. "And you've lost both. The words cut through Umoja's arrogance like a blade through silk. "Grab him!" he screamed. The two thugs lunged forward, but Traoré moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years in military combat training. He sidestepped the first attacker, caught his wrist mid-swing, and twisted it behind his back in one fluid motion. The iron rod fell uselessly to the sand. The second thug received an elbow to the solar plexus that left him gasping and on his knees. Both men collapsed onto the sand, groaning. Umoja's eyes widened with something he hadn't felt in years, genuine surprise, perhaps even fear. You're not an ordinary man." Traoré's lips curved into a slight smile. "I'm very ordinary. I just refuse to tolerate extraordinary cruelty." At that moment, Aisama stepped forward, her voice ringing across the beach. "This is the moment we've been waiting for. This is the day our voices finally matter." The villagers began emerging from their homes, men with fishing spears, women with kitchen knives, elderly people with walking sticks. They weren't attacking, just standing, forming a human wall of witness. After years of submission, they were finally ready to be present for their own liberation. Umoja backed away, his thugs scrambling to regroup around him. "This isn't over," he threatened. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Traoré reached into his pocket and pulled out a small military radio. He spoke into it calmly. "Operation Nile Blue, immediate deployment required." Umoja's feet shifted nervously in the sand. The ocean birds suddenly erupted in a cacophony of cries, as if nature itself was announcing the coming storm. Traoré turned to Aisama, his voice soft but clear. "By tomorrow afternoon, justice will stand on this very sand. Then everyone will know. This land belongs neither to tyrants nor to presidents. It belongs to God and to those who work it honestly." That night, the village buzzed with a nervous energy it hadn't felt in years. People gathered in small groups, whispering about the stranger who had stood up to Umoja, wondering if he was a fool or a savior. Aisama moved among them, spreading a message of hope, though she herself wasn't entirely certain what the next day would bring. Umoja, meanwhile, retreated to his compound on the outskirts of the village, a fortified house built with money extracted from the people he was supposed to serve. He called his network of corrupt officials and local strongmen, ranting about the stranger who had humiliated him. "Find out who this man is," he ordered. No one makes a fool of Umoja Chakate and walks away, but his inquiries led nowhere. The stranger had seemingly appeared from thin air, and his two companions had revealed nothing about their backgrounds. Umoja's informants in the local police and district office had no records of any visitors matching their descriptions. As night deepened, Umoja grew increasingly paranoid. He posted guards around his compound and loaded his personal firearm, something he'd never needed to do before. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. On the beach, Traoré sat with Aisama and several village elders who had cautiously approached after witnessing the afternoon's confrontation. They sat around a small fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. "Captain," one of the elders began, using the alias they'd been told, "we appreciate your courage, but you don't understand the depth of Umoja's connections. He has friends in the district office, the police, even some military officers. When you leave, he will take revenge on all of us." Traoré poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the night sky. "I understand your fear. You've lived under his thumb for so long that freedom seems more dangerous than oppression. But I promise you this. After tomorrow, Umoja Chakate will never threaten anyone in this village again." "How can you be so certain?" Another elder asked. "Because justice delayed is still justice," Traoré replied. "It may take time to arrive, but when it does, it arrives absolutely." Aisama, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "You're not just a captain, are you? There's something about you. The way you move, the way you speak with such certainty. Who are you really?" Traoré met her eyes across the fire. "Tomorrow you'll have your answer. Tonight, just trust that I didn't come here by accident. I came because your cry for help reached the right ears." The next morning dawned clear and bright. The sun seemed to rise more slowly than usual, as if giving everyone time to prepare for what was to come. By mid-morning, word had spread throughout the village that something significant was going to happen on the beach. Even people from neighboring villages began to arrive, drawn by rumors that someone was finally standing up to Umoja. Traoré's team had worked through the night, setting up a makeshift platform on the beach using driftwood and old shipping pallets. Behind it, they hung a large piece of canvas as a backdrop. It looked like preparation for a community meeting or festival, but those who knew better could sense the gravity of what was actually being prepared. Umoja arrived at his customary time, his black SUV kicking up sand as it raced toward the beach. But today, instead of finding cowering villagers, he encountered a crowd of several hundred people standing in a semicircle around the platform. His thugs looked nervous for the first time, realizing they were vastly outnumbered. "What is this circus?" Umoja shouted, stepping out of his vehicle. "You people think you can challenge me?" A path opened in the crowd, and Traoré walked forward. Today, he had exchanged his casual clothes for a crisp military uniform bearing the insignia of Burkina Faso's highest office. The effect on the crowd was immediate. Gasps rippled through the gathering as recognition dawned. Isama stepped onto the platform, her voice amplified by a portable speaker system. "People of the coast, this is not an ordinary man. This is not just a captain. This is President Ibrahim Traoré, leader of our nation, who has come to witness our suffering and deliver justice." The color drained from Umoja's face. His thugs took involuntary steps backward. The crowd erupted in confused murmurs, shock, disbelief, hope, and vindication, all mixing together in a wave of sound. Traoré climbed onto the platform and raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried across the beach with the authority of both military command and presidential office. "Citizens, I have heard your cries. I have seen your tears. I have witnessed the systematic exploitation and terror inflicted upon you by a man who calls himself your chief but acts as your oppressor." He pulled out the old phone with the cracked screen and held it high. "Days ago, I received a video. In it, I saw devastation. I saw a woman standing amid the ruins of her livelihood, begging for help. That woman was my family, my mother's niece. But she could have been anyone's sister, anyone's daughter. Her suffering is not unique. It is the suffering of everyone who has been forced to live under tyranny." Traoré gestured to his officers, who wheeled out a portable generator and projection screen. Within moments, the video Isama had sent was playing for everyone to see. Umoja and his men destroying property, beating villagers, collecting illegal taxes, and laughing as they inflicted suffering. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Seeing their collective oppression displayed so publicly, with their president as witness, was overwhelming. Some women wept. Some men clenched their fists in renewed anger. Children who had been taught to accept this as normal began to understand that it wasn't. Umoja tried to defend himself, his voice rising to a desperate pitch. "This is a lie. This is fabricated. That woman set me up." Traoré's eyes were cold as they fixed on Umoja. "Every lie you've told, every family you've terrorized, every coin you've stolen, all of it ends today. You called yourself a chief, but you were nothing more than a common criminal who used fear as currency." At that moment, the sound of heavy vehicles approached from inland. 2 Navy trucks rolled onto the beach, carrying armed military police. Behind them came civilian vehicles carrying regional officials and, importantly, news cameras. Traoré had ensured that this moment would be documented for the entire nation to see. "Umoja Chakate," Traoré announced formally. "You are hereby arrested for extortion, assault, destruction of property, and terrorizing the civilian population. You will be tried under the full weight of Burkina Faso's law." The military police advanced. Umoja's thugs, seeing the overwhelming force arrayed against them, dropped their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. But Umoja himself, consumed by desperation and pride, wasn't ready to submit. He reached under his jacket and pulled out a pistol, waving it wildly at the approaching officers. "Stay back! I'll shoot! This is my beach, my territory!" The crowd screamed and scattered, parents pulling children to safety. But Traoré didn't flinch. He took a deliberate step forward directly into the line of fire. "Your real weapon was never that gun," he said calmly. "It was fear. and I came here specifically to end that fear. So shoot if you must, but know that it will be the last act of a coward, not a chief." For a long moment, Umoja's hand shook as he pointed the weapon at the president. But the certainty in Traoré's eyes, the absolute absence of fear, broke something in him. His hand began to tremble, the gun wavering. In that moment of hesitation, a Navy officer launched himself forward, knocking the weapon from Umoja's grip. It tumbled to the sand, harmless. Within seconds, Umoja was on his knees, hands secured behind his back with military-grade restraints. His thugs were similarly subdued. The reign of terror that had lasted for years ended in less than a minute once real authority arrived. The beach fell silent, except for the sound of waves and distant seabirds. Traoré stood over Umoja, who was now on his knees in the sand, his expensive clothes torn and his gold rings glinting mockingly in the sunlight. "You once told these people that you were the law," Traoré said quietly, loud enough for only Umoja to hear. "But the law is not one man's whim. The law is the collective agreement of a society to protect the weak from the strong, the vulnerable from the violent. You were never the law. You were always just a bully." Umoja's head hung low, whether in shame or sullen defiance, it was impossible to tell. The military police hauled him to his feet and began leading him toward the trucks. As they passed through the crowd, people remained silent. There was no celebration yet, no cheering. The weight of years of oppression couldn't be lifted in a single moment. Healing would take time. But Sama stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "This is the land where yesterday we trembled in fear. Today, this same land bears witness to justice." That seemed to break the spell. Slowly, a few people began to clap. Then more joined in. Within moments, the beach erupted in applause, not loud or raucous, but steady and sustained, the sound of people reclaiming their dignity. Traoré raised his hand again, and the applause gradually quieted. Today marks an ending and a beginning. The ending of tyranny, yes, but more importantly, the beginning of something better. Justice cannot be a one-time event. It must become the daily practice of every citizen and every leader. He gestured to the regional officials who had accompanied the military police. "These officials will remain in your village for the coming weeks. They will document your claims, return what was stolen, and help you rebuild. But the real work belongs to you. You must build a community that never allows another Umoja to take root." One of the village elders, the same fisherman Traoré had met on his first day, stepped forward hesitantly. "President Traoré, we are grateful beyond words. But we are also afraid. Umoja was just one man. There are others like him throughout our country. How do we fight them all?" Traoré's expression softened. "You fight them the way Sama did, by refusing to accept silence as safety." She could have hidden, could have accepted her suffering as inevitable. Instead, she documented the injustice. She reached out for help. She became a witness rather than just a victim. "Each of you has that same power." He turned to Sama, who stood at the edge of the platform. "This woman is a hero, not because she was strong enough to defeat a tyrant with her own hands, but because she was brave enough to believe that justice was still possible, even when every experience told her otherwise." The crowd's eyes turned to Sama, and this time, the applause was specifically for her. She tried to maintain her composure, but couldn't hold back the tears that had been waiting for release. These weren't tears of sorrow anymore. They were tears of relief, of vindication, of hope finally fulfilled. As the military trucks carrying Umoja and his men drove away across the sand, kicking up dust that glittered in the afternoon sun, the villagers began to sing. It was an old song, one that grandmothers had taught to grandchildren, about the ocean giving life and taking away injustice. The melody was haunting and beautiful, a perfect expression of this moment suspended between past suffering and future possibility. The military boat that took Umoja was not heading directly to prison. Traoré had given specific instructions that reflected both justice and symbolism. The boat slowed once it was several hundred meters offshore, and the officers aboard attached a thick rope to the restraints binding Umoja's hands. The other end of the rope was tied to the boat's stern. Without ceremony, Umoja was pushed over the side into the water. Not to drown, the rope was measured to keep his head above the surface, but to be dragged through the very waters he had, Terrorized for so long, you dragged the dignity of this community through the dirt, one of the officers explained dispassionately, as Umoja spluttered and gasped in the salty water. Now the sea itself will cleanse you of your arrogance. The boat moved slowly parallel to the shore, allowing everyone on the beach to witness this final humiliation of their former oppressor. Umoja struggled in the water, his expensive clothes becoming waterlogged, his gold ring slipping from his fingers to sink into the depths. The sea was indifferent to his suffering, just as he had been indifferent to the suffering of others. Some in the crowd watched with grim satisfaction. Others turned away, uncomfortable with the spectacle despite understanding its symbolic importance. Isama watched with an expression that was hard to read, not joy, not revenge, but something closer to closure. After 30 minutes, the boat returned to shore. Umoja was pulled from the water like a drowned rat, his face red from the salt water, his body shaking from exhaustion and shock. He no longer looked like the devil of the sand. He looked like what he had always been beneath the facade, a small, pathetic man who had mistaken cruelty for strength. The military police loaded him into a secure transport vehicle. As the door slammed shut, severing his last view of the beach he had terrorized, Umoja finally understood that his reign was truly over. The vehicle drove away toward the capital, where a proper trial awaited him. But everyone knew the verdict was already written in the testimonies of dozens of victims and the undeniable evidence of his crimes. As evening approached, the village transformed. What had begun as a day of confrontation and justice evolved into something else entirely, a celebration of liberation. Someone brought out drums, and others joined with improvised instruments. The music started slowly, tentatively, as if the villagers needed permission to feel joy after so many years of fear. Traoré sat among them, not on a platform or throne, but on the same sand as everyone else, eating grilled fish and drinking the herbal beverages that Isama had finally been able to prepare without interference. Children who had spent their lives knowing only to hide when strangers came now danced around the fire, their laughter piercing the night air. An elderly woman approached Traoré, her back bent from decades of hard labor. She carried a woven basket filled with shells and sea glass, materials she collected to make simple jewelry for tourists who rarely came. "President," she said softly, her voice weathered like driftwood, "I have nothing valuable to give you except this." She pressed a single shell into his palm, an ordinary shell, worn smooth by countless waves. "This shell has survived many storms. So have we, thanks to you." Traoré closed his fingers around the shell, recognizing the profound gift it represented. "Thank you, grandmother. I will keep this as a reminder that true strength isn't about weathering storms alone, but about helping others survive them too." As the night deepened, Traoré stood to address the gathering one final time before his departure the next morning. The crowd quieted, faces illuminated by firelight, looking up at the man who had restored their dignity. "Tomorrow, I return to the capital," he began. "The work of governing continues, and there are many other villages, many other Isamas who still wait for justice. But what happened here today must not be forgotten or diminished. You faced your fear. You stood witness. You reclaimed your home. That courage belongs to you, not to me." He paused, looking across the faces in the firelight. "Some will say I was merciful for bringing Umoja to trial rather than leaving him to mob justice. Others will say I was too harsh, that dragging him through the water was excessive. But justice is not about making everyone comfortable. It's about ensuring that cruelty has consequences and that the vulnerable can live without fear." Isama stood and raised her hand. "President Traoré, you gave us something more valuable than revenge. You gave us the knowledge that our government can work for us, not against us. You reminded us that we matter." "You always mattered," Traoré replied gently. "The tragedy is that you were forced to doubt it. Never doubt it again." Dawn came with a clarity that seemed impossible after the intensity of the previous days. Traoré stood at the water's edge, his boots just touching where the waves met the sand. Behind him, the village was beginning to wake. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children's voices carried on the morning breeze. The sounds of normal life, beautiful in their ordinariness. His two officers had already packed the jeep for the return journey. The military units that had arrived yesterday were preparing to establish a temporary outpost in the village until the regional government could guarantee ongoing security. Traoré had also ordered economic aid to be fast-tracked to the coastal communities, grants for small businesses, materials for rebuilding, and most importantly, a permanent legal aid office where people could report abuses without fear. Isama approached, carrying 2 bottles of her herbal drinks. One was bright yellow with turmeric, the other a deep amber with ginger and honey. "These are for your journey," she said. "When you're tired or discouraged, drink these and remember us. Remember that your work matters." Traoré accepted the bottles carefully, studying their simple labels handwritten with care. "And you remember this. You started this revolution, not me. You refuse to accept injustice as normal. That refusal is the foundation of every meaningful change in history." The village began gathering for his departure. The elderly fisherman he'd met on his first day stepped forward, leaning on his driftwood cane. "President Traoré, we are honored that you walked on our ground rather than simply issuing orders from a distant capital. You showed us what leadership looks like when it remembers its humanity." "Leadership is nothing without the people it serves," Traoré responded. "You are the true leaders now. You must hold me and every other official accountable. You must never accept silence as the price of safety again." A group of children ran forward, each carrying a hand-drawn picture. They depicted the events of the past days in the vivid, unfiltered style of youth, Umoja as a black monster, Traoré as a tall figure bringing light, and most prominently, Isama standing firm amid flames. One child had written at the bottom, "Justice came to our beach." Traoré knelt to accept each drawing personally, taking time to look at each one and thank its creator. He carefully rolled them together and secured them with a piece of twine. "These will hang in my office," he promised, "so I never forget why I serve." As he climbed into the jeep, the crowd began to chant, not a political slogan, but something simpler and more profound. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." The words rolled across the beach like waves, sincere and overwhelming. The jeep's engine started, and Traoré took one last look at the village that had become a symbol of something larger. The place where justice had been tested and proven possible, where one woman's courage had sparked a chain reaction that toppled a tyrant. As the vehicle pulled away, kicking up sand in its wake, Isama stood with her bottles raised high, the morning sun catching the liquid inside and making them glow like amber lanterns. Behind her, other women stood with their own products, fish, crafts, textiles, all the commerce that had been choked by extortion but would now flourish freely. The jeep climbed the coastal road, and Traoré looked back through the dust. The village was a small cluster of structures against the vast ocean, easily overlooked on any map. But he knew that what had happened there would ripple outward, inspiring others who suffered under local tyrants to believe that justice was still possible. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of what the media had dubbed "justice on the sand" spread throughout Burkina Faso and beyond. The videos recorded by villagers and news crews went viral on social media. The hashtag Sahel Justice trended across West Africa. Other villages began reaching out to the presidential office with their own stories of corruption and exploitation. The case had opened a floodgate. People who had suffered in silence for years suddenly found their voices, inspired by Isama's example and reassured by Traoré's response. In the capital, Traoré established a new rapid response unit specifically tasked with investigating reports of local official corruption and abuse. He staffed it with young, idealistic officers who hadn't yet become cynical or compromised by the system. And he made sure that Isama's video was used in their training as an example of how ordinary citizens can document injustice. The trial of Umoja Chakate became a national event. The courtroom was packed with victims who had traveled from the coast to testify. One by one, they told their stories: the extortion, the beatings, the destroyed livelihoods, the climate of fear that had suffocated their community for years. Umoja's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been operating within traditional power structures. The coastal chiefs had always collected taxes and maintained order. But the prosecution, armed with video evidence and dozens of witnesses, demolished that argument. Traditional authority didn't include burning businesses, beating children, or terrorizing women. The verdict came after 3 days of testimony, guilty on all counts. The sentence, 15 years in prison, plus full restitution to his victims. As he was led away in chains, Umoja looked nothing like the arrogant tyrant who had terrorized the coast. He looked like what he was, a criminal finally facing consequences. Back in the village, transformation was underway. With the seed money provided by the government and the newfound freedom to operate without paying illegal taxes, the women's collective flourished. Aisama's Sahel Justice stall became the centerpiece of a growing marketplace. Other women joined her, selling their own herbal drinks, crafts, and products. They formed a cooperative, pooling resources and supporting each other. The marketplace was named Liberation Beach, and a wooden sign at its entrance bore a quote from Traoré, "Where justice speaks, silence is no longer survival." A school was built, not a grand structure, but a solid one with a real roof, proper desks, and books. The women of the village insisted it be named after education rather than any individual, so it became the Light of Learning Academy. Children who had grown up watching their parents live in fear now attended classes where they learned not just reading and mathematics, but civic responsibility and human rights. The fishing cooperative that had been strangled by Umoja's demands expanded its operations. With access to microloans and freed from illegal taxation, the fishermen were able to repair their boats and upgrade their equipment. The catch improved, and for the first time in years, families had enough not just to survive, but to save and invest in their futures. Aisama became an informal community leader, though she resisted any formal title. "I'm not a chief," she would say. "I'm just someone who refused to stay silent." But people sought her advice, brought her their disputes to mediate, and looked to her as an example of principled courage. She also became a traveling advocate, visiting other coastal villages to share her story and encourage others to document and report abuses. She carried a tablet, a gift from the government, loaded with information about legal rights, how to contact authorities, and templates for organizing community cooperatives. Wherever she went, she left behind not just inspiration, but practical tools for resistance and rebuilding. 6 months after the confrontation on the beach, President Traoré returned for an unannounced visit. He wanted to see if the changes had taken root, or if, as often happened, initial enthusiasm had faded into old patterns. What he found exceeded his expectations. The marketplace was thriving, with customers coming from neighboring regions to buy products that had gained a reputation for quality. The school had a waiting list. The fishing cooperative had expanded to include several neighboring villages in a regional network, but more impressive than the economic indicators was the atmosphere. Children played without fear. Women conducted business with confidence. Men spoke openly about community issues rather than whispering in corners. The change wasn't just material, it was spiritual. A fundamental shift in how people understood their own worth and agency. Aisama was in her stall, now expanded and weatherproofed with a proper roof when Traoré arrived. She looked up from mixing a new batch of herbal drinks and broke into a wide smile. "President, you didn't announce your visit." "I wanted to see the truth, not a performance," Traoré replied, embracing her as family. "Tell me honestly, has it lasted? Or are there new Umojas trying to fill the vacuum?" Aisama's expression grew serious. "There have been attempts. A few months ago, someone claiming to be a regional security coordinator came and tried to restart the protection racket. But this time, we didn't wait for rescue. We documented everything, reported it immediately, and stood together. He was arrested within 48 hours. That," Traoré said with satisfaction, "is true justice. Not my intervention, but your refusal to accept injustice as normal." They walked together through the marketplace, and Traoré was struck by how many people simply waved and continued their work. There was respect, certainly, but not the paralyzing fear of authority he'd seen in too many places. These people had learned that leadership existed to serve them, not to be worshipped or feared. At the school, he sat in on a class where teenagers were debating the responsibilities of citizenship. One girl, no more than 15, argued passionately that citizens had a duty not just to obey laws but to question unjust ones. Another student countered that stability required respect for authority. The teacher moderated skillfully, encouraging critical thinking rather than rote memorization of government propaganda. This, Traoré thought, was how nations rebuilt themselves, not through grand declarations from capitals, but through classrooms where young people learned to think critically and communities where adults modeled principled resistance to injustice. That evening, Traoré sat once again around a fire on the beach, but this time the gathering was different. Young people who hadn't even been present for the original confrontation sat alongside those who had witnessed it. A culture of oral history was already developing, with elders telling and retelling the story of the day justice came. But Traoré noticed something important. The story was evolving in the telling. In some versions, he played a larger role, almost mythological. In others, Aissama was the sole hero, with Traoré as merely a supporting character. He preferred the latter versions, but understood the human need for narrative simplification. A young teacher from the school approached him hesitantly. "President Traoré, may I ask you something that might seem disrespectful?" "Questions aren't disrespectful," Traoré replied. "Silence in the face of confusion is." Why doesn't the government prevent men like Umoja from gaining power in the first place? Why must communities suffer until someone brave enough emerges to seek help? It was a fair and cutting question. Traoré considered it carefully before responding. Because government, even well-intentioned government, cannot be everywhere. Power corrupts at every level, and distance from oversight makes that corruption easier. The only real solution is an educated, engaged population that refuses to tolerate abuse. What happened here didn't start with my arrival. It started with Aissama refusing to accept suffering as normal and documenting the truth. My role was to amplify her voice and provide institutional support. But the courage was always hers. "So you're saying we can never fully rely on government?" "I'm saying," Traoré replied, "that healthy societies have a balance. Government must be responsive and accountable, yes, but citizens must be active and demanding. The day people become passive and simply wait for leadership to solve every problem is the day tyranny becomes inevitable. Freedom isn't a gift from government, it's a practice by citizens." The young teacher nodded thoughtfully and returned to the fire, clearly planning to incorporate this into her lessons. As the night grew late and people began drifting toward their homes, Traoré and Aissama found themselves alone on the beach, sitting where her stall had once burned. "Do you ever regret it?" Traoré asked quietly. "Speaking up, I mean. Your life would have been simpler if you'd just kept your head down like everyone else." Aissama picked up a handful of sand and let it run through her fingers. "Simpler, maybe. But I couldn't have lived with myself. Every time I saw another woman beaten, another child terrorized, another family destroyed, I would have known I could have tried to stop it and chose not to. That's a heavier burden than any risk I took." "You're remarkable," Traoré said simply. "No," Aissama corrected gently. "I'm ordinary. That's the most important thing for people to understand. I'm not unusually brave or strong or wise. I'm just a woman who refused to normalize injustice. If people think what I did requires exceptional qualities, they'll use that as an excuse not to act themselves. But if they understand that ordinary people can create extraordinary change, then maybe more will try." Traoré recognized the wisdom in her words. This was why real change had to come from communities themselves, not be imposed from above. Aissama understood something about power and agency that many political theorists missed, that believing in your own ordinariness is sometimes more revolutionary than believing in your exceptionality. "What will you do now?" he asked. "You've become famous in a way. You could move to the capital, work for the government, live a more comfortable life." Aissama laughed. "And leave this beach? Leave these women who are finally building something real?" "No, President. My work is here. There are still villages up and down this coast where Umojas operate. I plan to visit each one, show them what we accomplished, and help them organize. Change spreads village by village, not through government offices." Will you at least accept a salary as a regional community organizer? She considered this. If it comes with no strings, no requirement to soften my message or follow bureaucratic protocols, then yes. Resources help. But I won't be domesticated by government funding. The moment I become too comfortable, I stop being useful to my community. Traoré smiled. You drive a hard bargain, but I accept your terms. You'll have funding and official status as a community advocate with complete independence. Your only obligation is to file reports so we know where help is needed. They shook hands on it, an agreement between equals, despite their vastly different formal positions. The next morning, as Traoré prepared to leave once again, he felt a profound sense of hope that was rare in his position. Too often, presidential work involved managing crises, balancing competing interests, and making compromises that satisfied no one. But here, on this beach, he had witnessed something pure: injustice confronted, evil overthrown, and community rebuilt. The villagers gathered to see him off, but this time there was less ceremony. They waved and called out blessings, but they didn't stop their work. The marketplace continued operating, children ran to school, fishermen prepared their boats. Life went on, which was perhaps the greatest compliment they could give him. They no longer needed him to maintain their freedom. As the jeep climbed the coastal road for the second time, Traoré's radio crackled with messages from the capital. Political disputes, economic challenges, international negotiations, all the complex machinery of governance awaited his attention. But he carried with him 2 bottles of herbal drink, a rolled collection of children's drawings, and a simple shell from an elderly woman. These were his reminders of why power existed in the first place, not for its own sake, not for the prestige of office, but to serve ordinary people in their daily struggles against injustice. When power forgot that purpose, it became indistinguishable from tyranny. His chief of staff, who had been managing affairs in his absence, called to brief him on urgent matters. After the business was concluded, she asked, "Was it worth it, sir? Taking 3 days away from the capital for one village?" Traoré thought about the question seriously. In purely pragmatic terms, perhaps not. 3 days of presidential time dedicated to a small village when national crises demanded attention. But in human terms, symbolic terms, moral terms, it was absolutely worth it, he replied. Because the villagers now know that the government sees them, hears them, and acts for them. And because every other village in this country now knows that if they document injustice and cry out for help, someone will answer. That message is worth far more than 3 days of my time. Umoja's trial had concluded, but the implications continued to unfold. Several other regional strongmen, seeing one of their own brought down, grew nervous. Some fled their territories. Others tried to negotiate immunity in exchange for stepping down peacefully. A few doubled down, increasing their security and tightening their control. Traoré's administration developed a comprehensive strategy for dealing with each case. Those who stepped down peacefully and made restitution to their victims received reduced charges. Those who fled were pursued and prosecuted in absentia, with international warrants issued. And those who escalated their tyranny were prioritized for immediate intervention. The Justice on the Sand operation became a model. Small, rapid response teams that could deploy quickly to support local communities in confronting corruption and abuse. The teams included military personnel for security, but also lawyers, social workers, and documentation specialists. The goal wasn't military occupation, but empowerment, giving communities the tools and confidence to reclaim their own governance. Within a year, 15 similar operations had been conducted across the country. Not all were as dramatic as Umoja's confrontation, but each followed the same principle: amplify local voices, provide institutional support, and then step back to let communities govern themselves. The model attracted international attention. Other African nations began requesting assistance in developing similar programs. Traoré was invited to speak at regional conferences about community-led justice and accountable governance, but he always insisted that Isama accompany him as co-presenter. "I can talk about policy and implementation," he would explain, "but she can speak to the lived reality of suffering under tyranny and the transformation that comes with liberation. Her voice matters more than mine." 5 years after the confrontation on the beach, the coastal village had become unrecognizable to anyone who had known it in Umoja's time. The marketplace had expanded into a regional commercial center. The school had added secondary grades and was sending graduates to universities. The fishing cooperative supplied restaurants across the country. But more than economic prosperity, the village had become a symbol, a pilgrimage site for activists, organizers and communities fighting their own local tyrants. People came to see where it had happened, to talk with survivors, to learn strategies for their own struggles. Isama, now in her late 30s, had become a national figure despite her continued preference for simple living. She had helped organize dozens of communities, trained hundreds of activists, and inspired countless others simply by continuing to live according to her principles. She had married a teacher from the school, and they had 2 children who grew up knowing that their mother was a hero, not in the distant, mythological sense, but in the immediate, practical sense of someone who had fought for justice and won. The stall where she sold herbal drinks remained her base of operations, though she could have afforded something grander. The sign still read, Sahel Justice, and tourists often stopped not just to buy drinks but to hear her story firsthand. President Traoré, in his second term, still kept those 2 bottles from 5 years ago on his desk, though they had long since been empty. He kept the children's drawings framed on his office wall, and the simple shell from the elderly woman sat in a place of honor on his bookshelf. When foreign dignitaries visited and asked about these seemingly humble objects, amid the formal trappings of presidential power, he would tell them the story. Some understood immediately. Others thought it was quaint but ultimately insignificant in the grand scheme of geopolitics, but Traoré knew better. Those objects represented the actual foundation of legitimate authority, the trust between leaders and led, the reciprocal obligations of protection and accountability, the understanding that power without justice is simply organized violence. On the 5th anniversary of Justice on the Sand, a ceremony was held on the beach. A permanent memorial was unveiled, not a statue of Traoré or even Isama, but a simple stone circle with the names of all of Umoja's victims carved into the rock. In the center of the circle, a bronze plaque bore an inscription that Isama and Traoré had collaborated on. Here injustice was confronted and overcome, not by might alone, but by courage given voice and power given purpose. May all who pass remember, silence enables tyranny, but a single voice can start a revolution. The sand remembers, the sea remembers, and we remember. Hundreds attended the ceremony. Villagers, activists from across the country, government officials, even some international observers. The elderly fisherman who had warned Traoré on his first visit was still alive, now bent almost double with age, but insistent on attending. When asked to speak, he shuffled forward slowly and said simply, "I have lived through colonialism, independence, coups, and corruption. I thought tyranny was inevitable, that powerful men would always prey on the weak. But I lived to see justice walk on this beach in simple boots. I lived to see ordinary people reclaim their dignity. If I die tomorrow, I die having seen the impossible become real." There was a long silence after he spoke, the kind of silence that honors profound truth. Then, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in oranges and purples, the crowd began to sing, the same song they had sung 5 years ago when Umoja was taken away, about the ocean giving life and washing away injustice. Traoré and Isama stood side by side at the water's edge, watching the waves roll in with their eternal rhythm. Neither spoke for a long time, content simply to witness the moment. Finally, Isama broke the silence. "Do you think it will last? Real change, I mean. Or will new tyrants eventually emerge when we're too old to fight them?" Traoré watched the sun touch the horizon, the light dancing on the water like liquid gold. "New tyrants will always emerge. That's the nature of power. It attracts those who hunger for it. But now this village, and others like it, know that tyranny isn't inevitable. They've tasted freedom and justice. That knowledge once gained is nearly impossible to erase. The fight will never be permanently won, but each generation can choose whether to accept oppression or resist it. You've shown them that resistance is possible, That's a legacy that outlasts any individual victory. As darkness descended and the ceremony concluded, people lit small candles and placed them in the sand around the memorial. Hundreds of tiny flames flickered in the night breeze, refusing to be extinguished by the wind or the darkness. From the ocean, the sound of waves continued their endless rhythm, the same waves that had witnessed Umoja's reign of terror, that had carried him to his downfall, that would continue long after everyone present had passed into history. But for now, in this moment, the beach belonged to the people who had reclaimed it. The sand, once soaked with tears and blood, now hosted celebration and hope. And above it all, the stars emerged one by one, witnessing and remembering. Justice had come to the sand. And though the struggle would continue elsewhere on other beaches and in other villages, this place would always be a testament to what was possible when courage met opportunity, when ordinary people refused to accept extraordinary cruelty, and when power remembered its true purpose. The waves whispered their approval, and the sand, that ancient witness to human folly and nobility alike, held the memory in its countless grains, each one a testament that justice, though delayed, can still arrive. And when it does, it transforms not just laws and leaders, but the very soul of a community.